If you can hear any rain, I apologize. The weather over here hasn't been that great, and it's going to be this way for the next couple of days, unfortunately. But I was thinking about, how I write stories, and, the answer that's very simple. I always start with the characters, right? Like, who is this about? Um, or I'll get an idea of, this premise, right? And I'll think about how would this conclude. I always go back to this instance. I think I must have been in probably ninth or 10th grade. My grandfather was watching something on TV, and I guess it was some author, but they mentioned that when they write something, they're talking about writing books. They always start with the beginning and the ending, and you work your way in between to figure out how you're going to get to that conclusion. And as someone who has, you know, been writing things now for, I'd say, over 10 years. Yeah. I always have some idea of the characters, how the story starts, where they are specifically, and then where I want them to be or how I want the general story to conclude by the end of it. So, for example, when I did the video on the show I'd like to make, I didn't talk about how, when I first started coming up with ideas for that show about 2, 3, 4 years ago, I had the idea of, okay, first season starts this way and it'll end this way, and it'll be this many episodes, and everything in between is going to be getting from point A to point, B. And I should say that when I have to start something completely from scratch, it's a lot harder for me to come up with things because you're having to, in sort of, I guess, making your own world, determine what the rules are and who's who. Whereas if I'm continuing on from something that another person did, like the Halloween fan film, or just any of the proposed sequel ideas I might have to some movie or some season of some show, it's a lot easier for me to go, okay, this is picking up on what was presented here, and this is something that carries on from this. And I saw that when I was starting to write, or even just considering writing a second season of the show, so I wouldn't have to do it later. Um, I had the idea of, like, okay, the first episode, all the characters are in this place, and I knew they would be there from having at this point written the whole first season. And then I start thinking about, okay, what do I want them to be, or what position do I want them to be in by the end of the second season? And then again, you know how they're going to start and where they're going to end up, and then everything in between is getting to that point of satisfaction in terms of where they'll end up at the end of the story. And I should also say that the second season, coming up with ideas for and writing it, was a lot easier than the first one because you've already done one at this point. But also the second season doesn't introduce, I don't think, any new characters. So like you've already gotten some understanding of everyone from that original pack of, I think it was like 16 episodes. Same thing with the Halloween fan film, where you have an idea of the major characters from their appearances in either the fourth, the fifth movie, or in Loomis and Michael's case is the first and second one, and then you can kind of gauge from what you saw in the films how they would act in your proposed sixth film or fan film. And sometimes when I'm, again, this is mostly for stuff that I'm making from scratch, like not continuing off of someone else's work, I'll write out specifically what this person is. Like I'll say, okay, this character is 20, and their best friend is this person, and they like to read, and just to give me an idea of, like, okay, what, who are they? And sometimes I'll put things in the, like, I call it a synopsis of the person, and not even refer back to it during the actual show or movie, or whatever the finished product is. Like I remember that in the synopsis I had for the little brother character in the show, he likes wrestlers, because my little brother always liked wrestlers. And I think I make maybe 2 or 3 references, because I'm still rewriting some of the later episodes, but I make a few references to it, and it's not necessarily anything really important to the plot of the story. But it's one of those things that, like, is specific to him, kind of like makes him a little bit unique amongst the rest of the cast. Some differentiation. And of course, when you're doing a show as opposed to a movie, you can, have time to like spend 2-3 minutes having two characters argue about, who's your favorite wrestler, and do you like WWE or one of the other brands, and just you would be able to kind of veer off into this, not necessarily irrelevant to the main plot conversation, but having more time to explore stuff allows you to deviate for a larger excess of time than if you're writing a movie where you have to make every minute count. Because when I was doing the Halloween film, I wrote it where I always, again, basic synopsis of the plot that where I have the beginning and the ending, right? And then I go, okay, act 1 is this, act 2 is this, act 3 is this. That's how the Halloween movie was written. That's why I was saying that the way I probably would end up releasing that is we would do pieces of it, right? Just to kind of show you that I'm not just blowing hot air. This is something I'm very serious about wanting to make. And I'm really just trying to take my time to make sure the visuals look good and the script is, I don't want to say airtight, but certainly where I'm satisfied with it. And then it would get released in 3 parts, right? Halloween 666 Act 1, Act 2, Act 3. And with each one of these releases, I would always have the script as its own entity, where you're writing the movie, right? Here's the first act, here's where it starts and ends, and then act 2 is this and this, and then act 3 is like this big culmination of everything before then. So it really is a lot having to do with just having a vision of what you want to do with this story, right? Are there going to be any arcs? Are there going to, how long is this going to be, if it's a show or if it's a movie? And as long as you have some idea of where you're starting and where you're ending, I think you're most likely to make something that's decent. And you could argue that it might be, because the stuff I like tends to have an ongoing narrative, tends to be more, I don't want to say serious, but, just it's stuff where there's clearly some, again, trajectory of, okay, this is picking up from this, continuing on from that. Because there are episodes of the show, for example, that are standalone. You could just kind of watch them by themselves. You don't really, they might introduce a character, but besides that, it's its own story. But I still think having some, even if it's something that's kind of like, not really that serious, having some idea of, how do you want this to end? Some planning, right? Always will make you, make whatever you're writing, have a stronger chance of being decent. That's why when I hear about these movies and, that start filming without a finished script, I'm just like, what? Because, at least if I fail or I make something that's not really that great, it's largely cost effective. Like, yeah, it costs me time to, write it and voice it and whatever, but it's still like mostly just a thing that, is like a sour reflection of me. It doesn't really hurt anyone else. The idea of, having these different actors who are all collecting a salary, and you can't even guarantee that your film or show, and usually they do this with films. I know apparently Doomsday, the Avengers movie, Avengers 5, is apparently in the middle of having this same issue. But I just couldn't imagine, having all of these people who are depending on you in terms of, their careers and where they can kind of take their performance, and you can't even like think enough in advance to say, hey, maybe I should write out this whole thing before we get anybody to start filming. So for example, with the Halloween film, I started drawing portions of Act 1 without writing out the entirety of Act 2 and 3, but I still have a previous prior version of the script that I can rely on. And also I know that this is still like whatever alterations I might make in terms of dialogue, right? You're still going to get where that original ending was supposed to take place. I think planning is a big part of writing. It could be for an episode, it could be for a whole show, it could be for a book, it could be for a movie. Just knowing where you want stuff to go, who this story is about, what its intended purpose is, that can never do you any wrong.